Welcome back. If you're just joining us, my name is Johanna Koljonen and I'm an industry analyst working with the Göteborg Film Festival. Next to me now is a colleague from the wider Göteborg Film Festival family, Olle Agebro, who is editor of the festival's arthouse streaming service Draken Film, which in a pioneering support scheme this winter allowed new subscribers to donate half of their subscription fee for the first 6 months to their local art house cinema. Olle himself also has a background in art house exhibition. Welcome.
Thank you.
Joining us on Zoom are 3 guests from 3 countries. The first is Marike Muselaers, is co-CEO of the Lumiere group, a distributor and exhibitor in the Benelux countries. Lumiere's successful specialist TVOD service, which previously mainly sold TV series, was expanded this spring to provide a virtual cinema home for premier theatrical titles. Welcome, Marike.
Thank you, Johanna. Happy to be here.
From Berlin, we are joined by Matthijs Wouter Knol, who is director of the European film market. We now particularly remember this year's edition of the EFM and the Berlinale for just squeezing through the gates before the lockdowns began. But perhaps the most important contribution in the long term was a radical sustainability charter. Welcome, Matthijs. Do we have you here? Can I hear you, Matthijs? I do not have sound. Let's see.
Now I'm here. Thank
Excellent.
You. I heard you loud and clear.
Perfect. And finally, in the UK, I think in London, is Catharine, director of the Independent Cinema Office. And if you've been following the industry during this crisis, you will have come across the studies that ICO put in place with lightning speed to monitor the resilience of independent exhibition in the face of both public health restrictions and the financial effects of the pandemic. Welcome, Catharine.
Hello, thanks very much for having me.
So our topic today is building a better new normal. And I would like to begin by asking each of you to tell me one thing about how the film industry used to work when it was business as usual that you would not want to return to. Something that was true last year that you would like not to be true in the future about this industry. Olle, you're nodding. Would you like to begin?
Yeah, sure. I think from our perspective, the most important difference is before the pandemic, our audiences really had quite limited access to films. In Sweden, an art house film could premiere in perhaps just a few cinemas in the major cities, and when it stopped screening, audiences had to wait for perhaps 4 months until the film was available again on VOD platforms. And for many people in other parts of Sweden outside the big cities, films weren't available at all. Now, during the pandemic, I think we've really seen the power of simultaneously releasing films on VOD platforms and on cinema simultaneously. And we've been able to reach a much wider audience in entire Sweden, and I think this has also obviously during the pandemic benefited the industry as well.
Yeah, and we've learned that those audiences, sometimes there's a big city arrogance also. I think people in the industry think, oh, but people in small towns, they don't care. Oh, but they do, it turns out. Yes. What about Marike? What would you not like to return to?
I'm really happy that as an extreme evening person, I can finally control my own time now, so I don't have to take those early morning meetings anymore. No, I totally agree with Olle that there is a new appetite for the film format, first of all, as opposed to just binge watching TV. People really have returned to watching films again. And yeah, we can all agree that the theatrical window is super valuable, but now finally we also all agree that other options are available and it doesn't have to be set in stone.
I guess the question is, do we all agree? And does the industry more broadly all agree? But we'll return to that, I suppose. What about you, Matthijs? What would you like to see us change?
Well, what I am actually secretly really enjoying is that, a bit linking to what Marike just said, I'm really enjoying the fact that we all of a sudden are capable of sitting in rooms saying, okay, so this is not working, what can we do right now? And actually make it work pretty fast, which I think some of us have been trying in the past years to do without always knowing what actually the effect would be. So it's actually quite, apart from many things that are complicated and we know there is no solution, but it's great to see people switch to a mindset in which actually opportunities can be taken because we just have to. And I would actually like that would stay. I mean, I would not like to go back to rooms where people say like, that won't work, let's not do that. So I think that would be good.
With my other hat on, I work with designing for human interaction. And in my office, we have a sign that says, design is the opposite of tradition. And the idea is that when you're doing things, in the way it's always been done, if that's your reason to continue doing it that way, then you are not making good choices. You're not thinking about your targets or resources or doing design. So yes, I have to agree. This is a wonderful change. What about you, Catharine?
This all sounds funny actually, but I quite like being able to come to Cannes and watch films and take part in panels and not necessarily have to travel so much all the time. So of course we all love travel, and I do love film festivals, but there are lots of things that are now taking place kind of online that I had always thought, people had been generally thought would not be, quite as well, or that, we ourselves have had to deliver courses online. We've done panels, we've done kind of conferences, and in the past, there had been a kind of received wisdom that it would not, the experience would be different. And actually, the experience has been so much better than I imagined. And I think I think that's what we're all talking about. Actually, is this sort of reimagining of how the business works, and we're seeing all of these different relationships and collaborations and partnerships and conversations and ideas that in the past would have been thought you just couldn't do that. That's not the way it was done. That won't work. People won't accept it. And because we've had to do those things and they have worked, that's the thing that I really like.
So let's start with that then. It seems that some of you were touching on this idea of just better working conditions for people in the industry. I feel like my stereotypical image of any colleague anywhere in the film industry is that we are constantly exhausted. And maybe also because we mostly meet at festivals where nobody really has time to sleep, so everybody's a little bit gray and like hyperactive. Will we be able to change? And I mean, for instance, what does it mean for the market schedules? Will some events disappear entirely? Will they move online? What do you think will happen?
I think, it's a bit early, I think, to say what will really happen. But my feeling is, and that's also something that you pointed out in the talk that was just prior to our panel here, there's, I think, a lot of people developing hybrid versions, because just replacing one shape with the other, I don't believe very much that is always the best solution. But to basically merge from one shape into another, even though we're now sort of forced to like radically do some things in a different way, I think, as Catharine says, I mean, we also know that it's quite vital and important in order to meet new people and to get new ideas or to decide which project to embark on. It's important to meet people as well, not only online. So I think to have that possibility linked to a couple of things that actually work quite well online, or the increasing possibility to work from home, to juggle better with, like time that we spend on working and time that we spend on private life, which I think also that balance absolutely is something that can be improved in some cases. So that sort of hybrid version of having a market that takes place on the spot and people can go there, but also people who are not able to go there or never have been able to go there can actually attend a market that is more and more taking place online as well. And I think especially when it comes to conference formats or networking formats, if they're cleverly done and developed, based also on the standard I think the Marché Online is setting right now for the coming year, I think that will add something to the market experience as we knew it so far.
I think a lot of the film festivals that we have spoken to that have had to take their festivals online have all of the ones I have talked to have spoken about how it's been amazing to see who has come and watched films, who their audience is. So they've all talked about the extension of that audience beyond the usual audience, reaching different people that never heard of them before, who, sometimes in their own country, and that kind of engagement with different audiences. And one of the key things about independent cinema and film festivals is is that thing about developing audiences, about where is the audience, where are the new audiences, how can we reach new audiences. And I think what we've seen with that hybrid model, as you spoke about, is the ability to do that. So I think that is something that people will engage with a way that they hadn't really necessarily thought that they would before. So I think that's what you will get, because it opens up a different set of possibilities. And I think then it allows organizations and activities to become a lot more inclusive, so that you can engage people that for whatever reason are not able to come to your event. You're starting to see different faces in those rooms, and that is something that is fantastic, and I think has shown us the way that we might start being able to develop what we do.
In fact, a year ago in Cannes and 2 years ago, we spoke quite a lot about the situation of young parents or parents of young children, which of course, given other structures or skews towards many mothers struggling to be able to also stay for the duration of the festival, for instance. And those kinds of things are also, I mean, we don't think about those as so much as sort of inclusion actions, but of course they are. Marike, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say from a buyer's perspective, it's also been very interesting, because I've been able to attend markets in Asia, in LA, that I would normally not go to. And that really gave me a new perspective. The only thing, and me and Matthijs were talking about this earlier, the only thing that I really miss is those people that you would normally not meet, those spontaneous meetings, those spontaneous projects that you get pitched at a market. That is the kind of thing that I do really miss, because in a way it's all very organized. Mm.
I guess we have to create some kind of infrastructure for spontaneous meetings somehow. Now, it had already looked for a while before all of this started like exhibition was polarizing into like a blockbuster industry and everybody else industry. And both the two different kinds of venues, of course, they both focus on the social and physical experience, but they do it in different ways. And the release patterns and the business models for blockbuster film and every other kind of film were already starting to drift apart. So my question, I guess, about the pandemic perspective of this is like, what have you learned in the last 5 months about the future of exhibition?
Shall I come in?
Yeah, sure.
Well, we on the day that we had to close our 3 cinemas, we launched an online platform for those films that were in the cinemas. Basically, in one day, it was almost like being in a war room. Every moment there was someone coming in saying, "Yes, we're going to close. No, we won't close." And we had to make that happen. So there was quite an interesting dynamic. And I think in these 3 months, we've proven that people indeed do go online and watch those films. So I do think that in the future there will be a coexistence of films in cinemas and films on the platforms. Finally, because we've been talking about this for so long already. I've also seen the power of, let's say, other business models than SVOD and linear and cinema. So people really have gone back to transactional because they want to watch a certain specific film or TV show. And that might be something that we'll see more in the future as well, developing on top of all those subscription models.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And also as a complement to them, as we were talking about in the previous conversation, we find some kind of cap for families, especially in this economy, for how many subscriptions you want. Olle, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think this is something that we have discussed and talked about for several years, but during these few months, we have finally been able to test different strategies and windowing on a larger scale. And I think the industry have had a chance to learn a lot from these weeks about what kind of films work for a simultaneous release and what kind of films that would actually benefit from a strict classic windowing. So, but I also think that cinemas has a lot to learn from this as well. When they are finally able to open again, perhaps at the limited capacity, I think cinemas will find that the opening weekend will be so much more important than even more important than it was before, and I think this will actually benefit event cinema, Q&A screenings and talks, because you will actually be able to reach your limited capacity for just a few screenings.
But then also targeting becomes incredibly important in the marketing, so that you get, because you want to get the 50 most passionate people or whatever it is.
Correct.
To keep the word of mouth going. Yeah. Then you're suggesting in a way that the slow build. Will we have sleeper hits again? Because that's, of course, been the challenge. There has been no space in the cinemas for titles to grow slowly.
I definitely think we will have sleeper hits, but they will be hits on VOD. I think they will have a really short release window on cinemas, and hopefully to a targeted audience that will fill those 50 seats or whatever. But I think the wider audience will be on digital platforms.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you guys agree? Matthijs?
Yeah, I do agree. I think with what Olle just said, but I think also I experience from what I've done myself, but also what I've seen in the behavior of people around me, or what you could see on social media, just the surprise of all of a sudden huge collection showing being made available online by either Mubi or, for example, ITVA, that just within a week put 300 documentaries online that they apparently had anyway, which I think was fantastic, and people sort of jumped onto it and were very grateful for it. So it was funny to see, first of all, how some parties were very quick in organizing that and others actually did not do that. And I felt that if many other people would take the chance to sort of see how a whole new market in that sense, or a lot of new or maybe existing viewers would actually be quite keen on rediscovering films, and then also realizing that it wouldn't harm their business maybe too much to think also about future models when it comes to like having a cinematic release, but also a release online. I think that's actually an interesting thing that we could also see in the past couple of months happening.
Marike?
Yeah, I think we also saw that in that sense, the power of free, that a lot of companies realized, oh, okay, we make all these products available right now just to be nice and to give a gesture to people who are sitting at home during the lockdown, etc. But now everybody realized that they have actually generated really valuable data with that. So in a sense, it has value to put something for free online as well.
Yeah.
I'm realizing also, I heard in a seminar yesterday that Netflix films, for instance, that had last year in the real world, in the normal world, when Netflix films were screened in the theaters, what often happened was that in the 2-week exclusive window they did okay, but then once they were also on Netflix, they actually did much better in the theaters. So there's also something here about these combined models that would allow something to grow more slowly, that you can build a title. If it's the title that has big potential, you can build it over time. It feels strange. Parasite feels like so long ago, but of course these release strategies, especially in the US, where they built up the number of theaters very, very gradually to culminate in the Oscar weekend. I think there is, certainly not for all titles, but for those who have big breakthrough potential, that is also, I guess, a way. Catharine, what are you thinking?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think in a way that those that kind of are making work that would be traditionally seen as smaller or more experimental, more independent, free, is a way of allowing your audiences to kind of take some risks that maybe they would be reluctant to take in the cinema, and in them doing that you would hope that they might take some more risks when they are able to go back to the cinema. And that can only be good. That can only be a good thing, because in the UK, what we've seen maybe over the last 20 years is broadcasters becoming, if you like, more conservative in terms of the sorts of films that they would show than they would maybe have shown 20 or 30 years ago. And therefore, a lot of cineasts or people maybe of my generation would have discovered lots of different kinds of cinema, world cinema, by watching the television. That's something that's maybe that was not so possible. So I think if what has happened as a result of this crisis is you get streaming platforms making all kinds of work available and drawing attention to that work, that is a good thing. That's how people explore and discover things. Because as we know, audiences don't necessarily choose what they don't know, particularly in a city. People don't choose what they don't know. And the job of kind of curators or programmers or people who work in this industry is to encourage them to take those risks, or not see, or not for them not to see them as being risky. And I think if you get a kind of wider proliferation of that kind of work across all platforms, you will get audiences willing to engage with a wider range of work. And that can only be a good thing, really.
Yeah, I'm thinking about these underlying structures. That's very interesting, of course. How do we make new cinephiles? We have failed, I feel, and I will return to it in the lecture as well. I think we have failed one generation of viewers in that respect. I wanted to ask about structures, the hidden structures in a way of the film industry. I would argue that in crisis in general, those who are strong get stronger, and those who are fragile are really struggling. And that does seem to affect, to apply to us as well. The tech companies are doing great. Although I guess maybe Apple's hardware sales will go down in a recession, but they have so much money in the bank, so they'll be fine anyway. Established streaming for services, big or small, have expanded successfully, but the very new ones have, of course, struggled and so on. I would ask you, what have you observed about power structures in the sector during this time?
Actually, I'm not sure if it's about strong getting stronger. I think we obviously have seen great companies like theater chains that have huge issues now, and the companies that actually benefit are those tech companies. In part because, well, obviously they are not operating cinemas without an audience. But I think more importantly is that they have the advantage of data. And I think that the pandemic has only reinforced this advantage, and I think this will be much more important during the upcoming years. And the tech companies have access to audience data that most cinemas can only dream of. And I really think that this is a key question for many cinemas, that if you can actually access that audience data from your audience, and if you can find smart ways to take advantage of it.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most cinemas are not using the data they have or can easily have.
Yeah, sure. Correct.
Much as they should, yeah. And that is very qualitative often, even though it is not as large. They have the potential for better data.
I think as Catharine mentioned, I think this is really key to build those local audiences and targeted audiences.
Yeah. So who else? What have you learned about the secret or visible structures of power?
Well, I think one thing that is also when we look at festivals, but also markets, where we see, the huge ones are like most challenged, basically, also to see how they will be able to continue. If you look at the more, I wouldn't say the smaller ones or the less relevant ones, not at all. I think some of the festivals that have not the huge, big festivals like Cannes, Berlin, or Venice, have actually proven to be sometimes more flexible to sort of navigate into different directions, or to put their team together and say, listen, how to do that. I mean, Cannes, of course, with the market is now doing that this week. But I think for these bigger festivals, it's not only about the versatility or the flexibility in how to change and how to maybe make sense in a different world in which less visitors also coming to the cinemas. I think it's also about, like how do you position yourself? What are the choices you make when it comes to which content, in which context do you show that content? Are you only going for world premieres? Like that whole rationale behind the large A-film festivals. I mean, that's something I think that is also about to be rediscussed or rethought. And I think we kind of have to, because that old system that worked for many, many, many decades doesn't always work so well if a situation like this would continue to exist for, let's say, another year, which would not be very unlikely.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's awful to think, but it is, there might as you say, very likely to have another year of this. And I guess you're saying that festivals are a little bit weighed down by their tradition and their status also, that it costs more for them to try different things because it can create a suggestion, or at least there is a concern that it might create a suggestion that what they were doing before is not as inevitable and valuable as we would like it to seem, of course, when we are institutions.
Yeah, I mean, we see now that a huge institute that is a landmark event for everybody, the Cannes Film Festival, is not taking place. Okay, that can happen, as we all see, and hopefully it will take place next year again, maybe the year after. But the thing is, in that sense, that you can't just say, listen, okay, then we just skip 1 year and we just keep things as they are, because different choices are being made. You can make, in that sense, a list of saying these films would have been at the festival, but it's also something you cannot maintain and keep on doing. And other festivals won't be doing that as well, probably. So to sort of like redefine, I'm not saying this because I think it's fantastic that it has to change. I think in many cases it worked quite well. But in this case, it could be an opportunity to sort of say, listen, what would be the other ways for these huge festivals to operate and still form and offer a platform for also the larger titles that are not very keen on online screenings. Yeah.
Catharine, what have you learned about power?
Well, I think it's a great leveler, this crisis, obviously. It is a great leveler. So, as Matthijs said, there's a thing about scale that in our previous world made a difference, where actually in this world makes less difference. I think on the kind of negative side, in some senses, if you have a lot of investors, you're able to ride out this crisis. If you're able to talk to your investors and get a big influx of cash, then that's going to make a difference to you. And if you are small and independent and you're owned by one person, or you're a charity, or you're a trust, then you might be in trouble, and that's problematic. And that's the same as it's always been. But I suppose what I also see is that the kind of warmth that comes from those, in terms of my sector, from those smaller venues, from those kind of communities, the sort of the power of that community. There's a real kind of sense that people are well aware that if some of those venues go, that they won't return, and that's how a lot of films will find their audience. And so it's so important that they stay, that network stays. And so what you've seen is so many communities giving, their own money, donating to their venues. You see lots of things with venues making their space open for maybe community initiatives in the kind of towns or cities that they're in. I think you kind of see it almost, I think those of us who work in that sector know this already, that it's not just cinema, it's not just about watching films, that there are lots of other things that go on in their spaces, both in regular cinemas and in film festivals. But I think maybe kind of in the wider world, there's been a sort of like acknowledgement that actually there's something much more powerful at work there, and that if you like a commercial sector, which is much more obviously and has to be it has investors about profit and loss, can actually learn some of the things that are going on there about what's meaningful within that industry, and the kind of transaction between an audience and a community in those spaces that is actually really powerful.
Yeah, well, exactly. I realized as you were explaining that is in fact that there is a power structure, or there is an asset which is that live relationship to your local audience. That in a way, even if you maybe haven't thought about it as a small exhibitor in terms of audience data, that relationship, of course, is exactly that. Marike, you're nodding.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen that a lot as well here with our local cinemas and the communities around it, and how they wanted to support the cinema, etc., etc. But I think it's also important that during the lockdown, there's been a huge emphasis on buying locally, support your local communities, your local cinemas, your local shops around the corner, your local bars and restaurants, etc., etc. And I think in terms of local streaming services, local cinemas, that has really given them an advantage as well.
Yeah. So we've touched upon this indirectly, I think, but I'll ask you this question, Catharine. If I had asked you in January how independent film is doing, what would you have said then?
Oh, well, at that time I would have said it was doing better than I had ever known it in my entire career, which is about, the last 25 years or something. So we're seeing, a lot of success with really interesting films, and really interesting things happening with audiences, some really interesting projects coming through, some great filmmakers. In terms of exhibition, we're seeing higher audiences than ever. We're seeing a massive proliferation of film festivals. Just in the UK, we were seeing a better investment in that sector than I had ever seen. So I would have been really positive, actually.
Are you still? Are you still positive? I mean, has any of that actually changed?
I think some of it hasn't changed. I think going back to what I said before, I suppose a part of me at this very moment, a lot of my work is kind of about trying to ensure that kind of network of venues or cinemas is still there when we come out the other side, and that we do our best to support them. So I think some of that is still there. I think obviously all the talent and all the interesting work is there. I think those audiences we talked about, where those audiences might come from and what they're watching at the moment, I think they're still there. But I think it's about the infrastructure, that you make sure that those structures that the chain that brings new work to the audience and everything in between remains, and that we manage to save it. Because I think a lot of venues, a lot of organisations, a lot of companies are in, some of them are struggling, and some of them will continue to struggle, and they won't all survive. And I think we all know that. I think that what's happening economically is going to be really, really difficult. So it's about looking at the models that you need, the business models that you need that will work, that can change, that aren't sort of stuck in stone, so that you have other options, so that you can be adaptive, so that you can react to all the kind of new possibilities that there are.
Matthijs, seeing as you just ran, it feels like yesterday, you ran our last big market. I mean, you would know, I suppose, if in February independent film was doing great.
With Catharine, I mean, I think in many ways there were quite some quite some people will also say, well, we were still struggling and it was not an easy market for us. I know that for a fact, but I think in general, when you looked at the possibilities and the different players being active, Berlin was a good market for many people. And I think in general, the industry, for the reasons Catharine just said, was not in such a bad shape. And I think people had, in that sense, good expectations for 2020. That's a bit like how people left Berlin. That was the feedback that we got, also the surveys that we did, which obviously coincided with like the first week of being at home and thinking, okay, I'm saying this now, but let's see how things are going to continue. So yeah, that's true. But I mean, a film market in that sense, Berlin is the first big international film market taking place. It's a market that just is a fragment, just a little moment in time where you feel like, okay, things are taking off well, or people having high hopes for a couple of deals that we're going to make. But that can be quite different, disregarding the fact that we're now in a pandemic. It can be quite different in a couple of months. But I do have the feeling that this was actually, in that sense, a year that started well, and people had a feeling like, okay, let's see what's happening, because it doesn't feel that bad, to put it a bit more, not so positively, so to say. Can I ask something else? Because I've been just wondering, if that's allowed, Johanna, I've been just wondering, because you referred to that before, like when we all start thinking, and I've been thinking about like a sustainable industry and how that might work, even in this time in which we feel, okay, we're now all like stuck at home or in our offices or not being able to do as much before. It might take a little bit more time. And we all say also that we don't want to stay too much or we don't want to go back to how it used to be, because actually some things are quite interesting to have changed. I mean, do you think it's realistic, and I'm also asking this to you and to the others, do you think it's realistic to have a bit more of a focus on a region in which we live? Meaning in this case, more of a focus on Europe in that sense, where we are where it will be easier to travel in different ways, also in a more sustainable way. But I sometimes feel, also linking back to the market, I sometimes feel that the relevance of a market, or what we can actually offer to people, will be sometimes easier if it's focused on the people that actually are can easily more travel to that event. So a more regional focus per continent in that sense. I wouldn't be surprised if that would be an outcome in the next couple of years, where people say, listen, that's how it happens. Of course, we can communicate online and do business online as well. But for this other part that we're missing, it will maybe have a bit more of a focus on Asia, Europe, Latin, or North America.
So do you mean in general that we would change our working methods to have more of regional focus, or do you mean specifically that physical meetings would be more focused in that way?
I think both, because if the physical meetings are more easy in a region or in a continent in that sense, which I think is the case, it's still... I tried out my first train trip last weekend, which went quite well. If you travel through Europe by train and you prepare yourself, you have a couple of face masks, you can travel quite far. But I have the feeling that in that sense, it might be something that will affect business to some point. I don't know, but I have a feeling that it might be something that will be an outcome in the next years, not only because of business models, but also because of the way we want to travel in the future when we're talking about environmental sustainability, for example.
For sure. So what do you all say about this regional focus?
No, I totally agree. I think, and it actually links back to what I said about buying locally and the focus on local communities. Sorry, Amsterdam sounds here. But I think it also links back to co-productions and how we're going to move on with European co-productions in the future. We at the moment we're ramping up a Norwegian Belgian restrictions for traveling, but we probably won't see those American co-productions that much anymore, where the American studios come in and just dip into certain countries for tax benefits. I think in that sense, it's going to be more of a focus on Europe and on the countries that you can indeed reach by train or more easily. Do you believe in a European audience? As an European, all of Europe as a market, yes. As an audience with an identity somehow, I am interested in European cinema. Yes, but I do think it would be, let's say, more of a partnership between different territories, where each territory can actually really market their and target their local markets. What are you thinking, Olle?
I'm just thinking back at our numbers on our VOD platform, and actually, we have a majority of European content on Draken Film, but European films are also the most popular. So perhaps there is a European audience looking for European films.
That's promising. We are moving into the last bit of this conversation, and I'd like to reconnect to our headline, How to Build for a Better New Normal. We've mentioned certainly that traveling less and working more efficiently might free up some mental space for us to work smarter and to work differently. We've covered that there is now room, we have been given permission in some ways to change the things that we feel are not working about the industry. And we are feeling at least cautiously optimistic about the audience's investment in the kind of films that we're most focused on, all of us, and television series, of course, as well. What are the next steps? What would we need to change? And I would ask you maybe to be specific, who needs to do what? What can we do? What do we need to build? What structures, what steps do we take to make the change to be the change we want to see in the world, as the saying goes? Who'd like to start?
I actually think that we as a VOD platform need to cooperate even closer with cinemas. What we've seen during the spring is that by working closely with the cinemas, we can access an entirely new audience that are engaged on a completely different level. And I think that cinemas also has something to benefit from this cooperation. Now it's obviously been money, but I think that we can work together and build and develop new audiences, like Catharine actually touched upon previously. I think there are certain films that perhaps are seen as risky to watch on cinemas, that it's perhaps easier to just start watching while you're at home in front of your iPad or whatever. And I think that we as a VOD platform can be much better supporting cinemas by building interest in certain directors or certain kinds of cinema, and to sort of establish interest in certain kinds of films before theatrical release of a new Silenziama film. So
you're thinking about it both as a sort of signal boosting. So you can create within your audience, you can lift, let's say, the career of Silenziama and make her more relevant in the moment for a theatrical release by providing context. But then I guess also over time building a kind of film culture that we used to have an infrastructure for because of video film clubs and video stores and broadcasters programming that kind of cinema that infrastructure has disappeared. So this can become part of like recreating that.
Yeah, and I think that's actually our most important mission, to create new cinephiles and to inspire people to actually love these films. And also, frankly, I think that the new Silenziama film is much more impactful if you have recently watched her other films. And I think that we can build this context around a greater number of films.
That's a great idea. Everybody should definitely do this. What about the rest of you? What actions should we take? Matthijs?
Well, I think there's a whole thing. There's a whole range of things. First of all, I think the whole discussion we had a couple of months ago about environmental sustainability and how important it is for the industry. We should not forget that even in these times where we have to take decisions, and sometimes these kind of decisions also include investing or making different choices or relocating budget, that we should not forget that this is still an issue that we cannot forget. I mean, the film industry, and I mean, Nostradamus report has pointed it out, I think also in the past years, is an industry famous for navel gazing and focusing very much on like reinventing itself. But we should still, I think, and we had time to do that in the past couple of months, to realize in which world we're actually living, what's changing there. So I think to take that responsibility and keep on changing and helping each other doing that, making greener choices in that sense is a very important thing. I don't hear that discussion at all anymore, hardly. Another thing I think is also that, reinventing business models and seeing how audience and where they are, including great ideas that Olle just had. I think that's great. I think also focus on where we actually live helps sometimes to refigure out how we could actually do our work and reach audiences. So this focus on Europe, I think, is something that's strong. And last two things. One thing I think is about the infrastructure that we offer, which can be absolutely simplified and more in a hybrid version, as we said in the beginning. And as you said, Johan, in the beginning, I think this is also a time not just relating to what has happened in the last couple of weeks and months. It's also a time about thinking now we actually have enabled people to get access to films sometimes more easily, or enable people to attend film markets more easily and have a more diverse presence of people. I think that's also something that we, as the established industry, should really look at and take the next steps. And to make that very concrete, I mean, if we talk about like the white dominance in all the things that are representing the industry also in talks like this. I think it's up to us to say, listen, how can we change that, and to seek the conversation with representatives of other groups in the industry, and to actively look out, set up meetings and make that happen. So that's actually, I think, something that we in the next couple of months have more time to do so as well. And I think it's important to do that.
Catherine?
Yes, I agree with that. I think, what we've kind of seen with the Black Lives Matter movement and the way in which organisations have had to be more thoughtful or wanting to be more thoughtful, and to think about how they respond to that and how we dismantle systematic racism is got to be about starting with ourselves. So I think in answer to your question, who's responsible and who does this, I think it is all of us. It's kind of incumbent on all of us in all of our organizations. And I think those two, both Black Lives Matter and thinking about kind of the environmental crisis, is about what can we do within our work, what can we do within our organizations. And I think there are some really practical things about thinking about who you're talking to, who you're promoting, what work are you promoting, and how is that done? And those things have to happen internally, because obviously if they happen internally in every single company and every single organization, that's when you will start to see change. So I think I think actually there's if we think about the kind of bigger, corporations, or we think about governments, that's how change comes, because people demand it and ask for it. And I think the more that we as individuals do that within our own organizations, within our own companies, we'll kind of see some of those more powerful structures responding to that, because it will be necessitated by that kind of demand. So I think it's on all of us, if you like.
I agree, and I want to say that it's interesting because I think we will see many projects that are attempting to speak to this moment in different ways. But if it doesn't come, if you haven't done as an institution or as an individual that internal work, like the work with yourself first, I think it won't feel real. Like I think you have to connect with the work and with the stories when you're working for change to be able to connect with the audience's real needs. So it's also in that way, like it's a business requirement, it's an artistic necessity to start within ourselves and move on this. Yeah. Marike, final thoughts. What should we change next? Who should change it?
Well, linking back to what you just said, I think it's also that a lot of us, even though we all know representation matters, et cetera, need to amplify certain voices, we tend to say, oh, that's not our audience. And in the end, it's on us to indeed buy for the audience. But if we don't know our audience behavior and we don't have those data, we can't really say that's not our audience, right? We need to understand much more that is our audience. And that we do need to cater for all the audiences out there. And I think the pandemic has at least made us think a little bit more as, let's say, about audience behavior, about e-commerce, etc. In the end, we need to, as an industry, be, I think, more of an ecosystem, not too much of a top-down, structured, all set in stone rules value chain. And what I also think is that what we've seen is that the cultural industry as a whole, so not just film and TV, have come together in the last 3 months. And I think that's an important part as well. And we as a film and TV industry should really step up and help the rest of the creative industries during this difficult time as well. I mean, I think a lot of us have also discovered a lot more different forms of entertainment during the last 3 months. I mean, I've listened to so many audiobooks and podcasts, etc., etc. But I think that's an important part as well.
Yes, and also in a situation where we feel we are lacking stories, that was a thing we were looking for. Well, the arts would be an obvious place to start looking. We're out of time for this part of this session, but many of these themes, in fact, I will return to in just a few minutes in the final lecture here of this session. We're going to take a tiny break and then move on to the lecture part. But first, of course, I would say thank you ever so much for joining us. Catharine, Matthijs, Wouter, Knol, Olle, Agebro, and Marike Muselaers. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.